how did we get to this place where so many organizations are struggling, leaders are struggling with exhaustion and poor mental health?
I think it creates this fundamentally untenable situation. You are saying that that's what matters, to the exclusion of mental well-being,
Yeah,
to the exclusion of physical well-being,
yeah.
to the exclusion of the well-being of your communities. I could hear this exhale, and there was this moment, and the whole, even though we were just talking on the phone, the whole energy shifted. And employees know that all that other stuff does matter. It matters how they feel when they go to the job. It matters how they feel when they come home to their families. And he opened up to me. And then we went on the record and we had this extraordinary conversation.
In this first installment of our two-part conversation, I sit down with David Gellis, an award-winning reporter for the New York Times and author of the New York bestseller, The Man Who Broke Capitalism. David has established himself as one of today's most insightful business journalists, writing for both the Climate Desk and previously the business section of the New York Times. His reporting has earned prestigious Gerald Loeb and SABEW awards, and he contributed to the Emmy-winning documentary, Boeing's Fatal Flaw. Today, we'll explore how Jack Welch's leadership at GE fundamentally transformed American business culture, and not for the better. David reveals how this influential CEO's practices led to the widening wealth gap, declining employee satisfaction, and the explosion of billionaire wealth we see today. Join us as we examine the historical shifts in work culture that have shaped our current corporate landscape and discuss what might be done to repair the damage. This is going to be good. Hi, I'm Jenny Clark, a conscious leadership expert who spent 2 decades in executive recruiting and talent management, having worked with giants like Google and Spencer Stuart. I discovered that the secret to transformative leadership lies in the 5 dimensions of conscious leadership, and I'm here to help you unlock your full potential. Join me on this channel as we embark on an honest and vulnerable journey together to become the kind of leader that genuinely inspires transformation in your organization. David Gellis, welcome. It's great to see you again. We've met before. I have to tell you, your book is probably the one not necessarily your first, I don't think. The Man Who Broke Capitalism, which came out in 2022. It's the one that I go back to again and again, because so much of what I think about and talk about and speak to publicly about is what's happened in the world of work that got us to this place where so many people are struggling. Leaders and the rest of the workforce are struggling. So would you give an overview quickly of The Man Who Broke Capitalism and the thesis, and a little bit about your background that got you to this place of and depth of understanding of leadership and the
Sure.
corporate world?
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you for thinking of my book and reading it
I
and,
love
and
it.
understanding it at a deep level. Because that question, how we got here,
Yeah.
has animated not only that book, The Man Who Broke Capitalism, but also a lot of my work at the New York Times, where I've been a business correspondent and a climate correspondent for more than a decade now. And so when I think back to how we got here, like what happened in the world of work where so many people feel like it's not working for them,
Right.
so many people feel like they have this fraught relationship with their employer or with their jobs, I went on this journey that led me back decades, almost 100 years, to a moment where that wasn't the case,
Yeah.
where people did have this different relation with their work and with their vocations. And what I discovered is that it wasn't always that way.
Right.
And in the process of trying to understand, okay, so how did we get from there to here, there was at least one really pivotal inflection point. And I identify it as the year 1980, which is the year that Jack Welch, who was just one CEO,
Yep.
another guy that took over another company, became CEO of General Electric, which today doesn't mean very much to people.
No.
But in the 20th century, GE was like the company that defined the economy.
Everything.
GE made up 1% of America's GDP. It's the company that brought us the electricity in our homes, the dishwashers, the refrigerators. And for a long time, it operated in one way, in a way that benefited not only its consumers and yes, its shareholders, but also the people that worked there.
Right.
And then this guy, Jack Welch, came and he changed everything.
But he had been an employee. He had, right?
He was.
For 20 years before he became CEO.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand he was a manager.
A manager.
That entire time. He never worked on the factory floor.
Okay.
And there's a big difference there. And he approached his work at GE from the outset with this relentless focus on cutting costs. Even though the company was doing well, he wanted to cut costs. Even though his teams were working well, he wanted to fire people. And there was this understanding in his mind that the company needed to get smaller, despite the fact that it was doing really well. He wanted more profits with less people.
Now, but where did Milton Friedman come in? Because one of the, right, an economist from the University of Chicago,
Absolutely.
shareholder value being his sort of mantra, was that not part of Jack Welch's legacy?
It absolutely was. And the way I talk about it in the book, Ginny, is that Milton Friedman came up with these ideas a full decade before Jack took over GE. That famous essay in the New York Times Magazine where Milton Friedman says the social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits.
Yes.
I mean, just let that sit, right?
Right.
The social responsibility.
Social responsibility.
That's what he's saying is that's really at the end of the day what a business is for in society.
Yeah.
That was a radical idea at the time because up until that point, businesses had been the bedrocks of their communities. They had been the way that people found value and that companies helped their communities grow and prosper and flourish. And what he's saying now is, no, all that matters is making a profit at the end of the day. Okay, but that was a decade before Jack took over GE. Nothing really happened in that intervening decade until Jack showed up. And the way I say it in the book is Jack was the first one to operationalize that philosophy.
Got it.
He was the first one to put that into action.
And yet offer some statistics about what has happened, because that's something that I reference in some of my speeches.
Yeah.
And I give you full attribution.
Thank you.
Of, was it 940% increase in CEO compensation versus 12% increase in wages, worker wages.
Yeah. Even setting aside a specific stat, because the numbers aren't fresh enough in my mind that I'm going to be able to cite them accurately. But what I can say is if you look at any number of charts, you can identify the year 1980 as this inflection point. And you cited a very important one. Executive pay started skyrocketing, and worker wages, which had been more or less trending in line with executive pay, started to flatline. Here's another one. Union representation. Unions, labor unions, would protect workers, which bargain on behalf of the collective. They had been steadily gaining power throughout the 20th century. Jack Welch arrives and, yes, goes to war with the unions. At GE, union representation across the country starts to flatline. Here's another one. Research and development. All that money that companies spend investing in the brains, trying to get the next generation of products. At GE, R&D had been a big share of the budget, and that's what allowed them to be so innovative for so much of the 20th century. Jack Welch comes in, flatlines R&D. Fast forward a decade and a half, GE doesn't have any breakthrough products to show for it.
Right.
And so at every time you look, there are these inflection points, and Jack Welch was right at the center of it.
He's a scary guy. He was from Philly, I think. Was it Philadelphia?
Well, he was from the Boston area.
Scrappy.
He was scrappy. and here I want to make an important distinction. I wouldn't define him as a scary guy.
Okay.
He was beloved.
Yeah.
And he had loving relationships and a loving family. So I think it's so important not to demonize the individuals in cases like this.
Fair enough.
I make the case that he, as an executive, embodied and operationalized a set of values that have been really destructive to the American economy and to American workers. But I do think it's important that we not confuse that with our assessment of someone as a human being.
Fair enough. How did we become so enamored such that we didn't see it while it was happening? As an executive recruiter, I started Spencer Stuart in 1997.
Yeah.
And the chairman of Spencer Stuart is quoted in your book for extolling the virtues of GE. And at one point, I think there were 16 in the Fortune 500 maybe, or 100, I can't remember now, 16 ex-GE executives who had become CEOs. So it was the academy company. I mean, when we looked for candidates,
Yeah.
we would start by looking into, GE and ex-GE execs.
That's right.
And maybe the question is, when did the bloom fall off the rose?
Well, I think even before we get to how the bloom fell off the rose, it's important to recognize that the rose had a certain allure
Yeah.
for a long time.
Long time.
And not without reason, right? Like GE and Jack's success as CEO of GE was all predicated on increasing quarterly earnings and increasing GE's profits. He set out to make General Electric the most valuable company in the world, and he succeeded.
Yeah.
And you cannot take that away from him.
Right.
And that is so important to understand and reckon with.
Fair enough.
Because, well, why did other firms want GE executives to lead them? Well, because they learned from Jack, and Jack turned GE into the most valuable company in the world. Not hard to understand that. But of course, the real story can only really be seen in hindsight.
Yeah.
When you say, all right, well, what was the cost of all that wealth creation? Where did that wealth ultimately go? Was
Yeah.
it shared with the workers? Was it shared with communities? Or was it really enjoyed only by a small set of executives and ultra high net worth individuals who own a majority
Of the
of
stock.
those investment pools? And then you start to understand, oh, well, with hindsight, you can see the bloom does come off the rose.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you kind of look at where we are today, and even in the last 20 years, because I don't remember the year Jack Welch died, but I mean, he left quite a legacy, both favorable and not so favorable. But since then, so many things have happened.
Yeah.
We've had COVID, we've had remote work, we've had just a whole change in our economy, not to mention other changes, which we don't have time for. How did we get to this place where so many organizations are struggling, leaders are struggling with exhaustion and poor mental health, and a large portion of the workforce is struggling with that. So
Yeah, I want to come back to that notion that Jack Welch sort of embodied this priority of profits above all else.
yeah. Yep.
Right? When there is that singular focus that trumps all other concerns, I think it creates this fundamentally untenable situation where if you are saying that that's what matters to the exclusion of mental well-being,
Yeah.
to the exclusion of physical well-being,
Yeah.
to the exclusion of the well-being of your communities, of the nation, of the federal government's ability to meet its obligations in the form of tax revenues, all these other things that businesses do, the soft influence of business beyond just the hard realities of the bottom line. When you say none of the rest of that matters, that creates a tension because leaders know that all that stuff does matter.
Yeah.
But if their analysts are only focused on one number, well, they get caught in the middle. And employees know that all that other stuff does matter. It matters how they feel when they go to their job. It matters how they feel when they come home to their families. But if their boss is telling them, oh, no, all that matters is that productivity, however we're going to measure it. And if you're not absolutely keeping up, well, you're liable to be among that portion of the workforce that we've decided we're firing no matter what's happening. Stack ranking, right? This notion of firing people, no matter how well the firm is doing, we're cutting 10% of the staff at the end of the year, no matter what. So that focus, that relentless focus on profits above all else, that creates these tension points.
And I would think it also pits peers against peers inside of the organization.
Deliberately so, right?
Wow.
This notion of stack ranking, of identifying A, B, and C players, different companies have different ways to do it. Jack was the one that did that first at GE. This whole notion came from Jack Welch, and it's still at work today in big companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Uber. All these big tech companies still do it.
They sure do.
And yet they see it as a virtue.
Let me ask you this, because you've had such rich experience even before you wrote all of this. I mean, I think it informed the contents of your book.
Yeah.
What was the name of the corner office? Was the
I wrote,
column that you
that's
wrote?
right. Yeah, I wrote the corner office column for the New York Times for several years, where I
So you
hundreds
interviewed
of CEOs.
all these. So you got to see for yourself what good, better, and best, and not so good leadership looks like.
Yeah.
How did that inform some of what you wrote and some of what you're observing now.
Yeah. Well, there's the answer of how it led me to the book.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of the broader takeaways from my reporting on CEOs over the years.
And what we need now, by the
And
way.
what we need now.
Yeah. Tell me.
So the quick answer about how it got to the book is that when I interviewed hundreds of CEOs, one name kept coming up. And it wasn't Steve Jobs, it wasn't Mark Zuckerberg. The CEO that other CEOs kept bringing up was Jack Welch. And that just bugged me. I mean, this guy had been retired for almost 20 years. Like,
Right.
Why was Jack Welch, of all people, living rent-free in the mind of today's CEOs? Something was going on.
Yeah.
And so I had to go figure that out. That led me to go write the book. Setting that aside, I interviewed hundreds of CEOs about their values, their motivations, their mentors, their leadership styles, how they hire, how they fire. And it's definitely true that, you can see patterns start to emerge. And what I would say is, of the best leaders that I interviewed, right? The ones that really, I can just imagine them right now. It's like, my Mount Rushmore of great leadership. There are some commonalities, right? And there's little stuff. Most of them tended to be voracious readers, right? Just absolute masters of ingesting and processing and digesting lots of information.
That tells me
complex
curiosity.
Curiosity, but also with intention.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a passive curiosity. It's focused, deliberate, leaning in curiosity. Masters of assimilating information. They also tended to be, and this is related to that posture, they tended to have developed incredible work ethics at an early age. Not to say that they were focused on business from their career, but so many of them were, they were like the head of the drama club. Also not to say that they were overachievers. Some of them did it in their own very personal ways, but they were passionate and they were focused from an early age. And I think, again, when I'm thinking about the best leaders, that sustained them into those really singular roles where they could command the loyalties and the passions and the energies of large groups of people.
I love that.
So those are some of the little things, right? But then there's the big thing. And the big thing I would say about all the best leaders that I interviewed is that they all had a moral compass. They all had a set of values. And the values weren't always the same, right? Different leaders would prioritize different things. But they all knew what they cared about. They all knew what mattered to them and to the organization. And this is critical. They were willing to make sacrifices to live up to those morals. They were willing to take a stand publicly. Sometimes they were willing to take a stand with the president. Sometimes they were willing to take a stand with the media or with their own employees. But they understood what they stood for and what their companies stood for, and they were willing to go to bat for it. And even if not everyone liked it at the time, them demonstrating that sort of moral spine, that ethical backbone was a signal that, this leader is the real deal.
Well, doesn't that, or at least it's a heavy contributor to trust, is it not? Right? I'm going to trust that whoever is in the leadership role is going to support my interests, not just mine personally, but those of the organization as a whole.
That's right.
It seems real simple.
I think that's right. And also trust that this leader is not going to waffle and change her mind 3 days later because of some new signal, right? The trust in continuity.
Wow. So now, as we look at kind of where we are there any 2 or 3 things that you think contributed to us? There were many things that got us, there's this sort of, I'm seeing it in my mind, there's a big wave from 1980 and the wave is kind of hit. And now we're dealing with sort of the residual. And there's another wave coming, it would seem. There always is, right? And so how do we at least sustain ourselves now? How do we find some equilibrium as individuals, as organizations, during this really tumultuous time our world is the business world, but to me, it's happening everywhere across sectors, government, education. It doesn't really matter. It's all business at its core. What are the few things that both leaders and people not necessarily in leadership roles can be doing to even fortify themselves?
That's what I'm here to learn from you, Judy. You have the answers for that one, not me.
I mean, one of my things is start meditating. You need to go to a different place. Remove yourself from this dimension and momentarily to find some inner strength. And I believe that and mean that. I'm smiling, but it's part of my essence.
I was meditating last night, Ginny. In
I
fact,
love
my
that.
first book was called Mindful Work. And it was about how meditation was showing up in the workplace and how individuals could actually find some stillness, some sense of equanimity in themselves that might allow them to be a little more at peace at work. It's not a panacea, you know
No,
that,
of
right?
course
It
not.
doesn't make everything all right. It doesn't make all our problems go away, but it gives us the stability and the spaciousness to go through our lives in a way that hopefully we're not letting external stimulus define us, and we can really define how we move through our days and our careers.
And I would add, it hopefully gives us some semblance of respect and honor for the humanity in others.
Yeah.
Because I fear that we've kind of lost some of that. It's like we just kind of look right through each other
Yeah.
when people don't even make eye contact on the street anymore.
Yeah.
I think we're walking zombies.
Yeah. Can I tell you a story about that
Please.
from my own reporting?
Yeah.
So this was 6 years ago now. I think the year was 2019. And Elon Musk was in the news. He's still in the news.
Right.
When is he not? But this was right after he had sent that tweet, if you remember it. They're preparing to take Tesla public at $420 a share, right? Set off this crazy news cycle. I'm in the New York Times newsroom at that point. Everyone's trying to get a hold of Elon. No one could get a hold of him. I walk by an editor's desk and say, hey, David, can you get Elon on the phone? I was like, I'll try. So I work my contacts, and no one had been able to get in touch with this man for weeks. People have been trying. I get a call a couple hours later with no notice that says, hello, please hold for Elon Musk. Because I have good sources, okay?
I'll say.
So I knew how to get him.
Yes.
And he called me. And first thing he says is, this is off the record. And I say, well, and he says, I'm hanging up if it's not off the record. And I was like, okay, we're off the record. And it was very tense because we had never talked before. And so the first thing I said, because I had no notice, I said, so Elon, why did you send that 420 tweet? And he said, I already explained that. He sent a tweet about it or something. I already explained that. Next question. And I'm like, oh, this thing's going off the rails immediately. And I said, Elon, how are you? And he said, I said, like, how are you doing? Are you okay? And he's sort of like, I could hear this exhale, and there was this moment, and even though we were just talking on the phone, the whole energy shifted. And he started talking to me, Ginny, about how lonely he felt, about the fact that he felt like his friends had abandoned him. And he got so real with me.
He doesn't know you.
We never met. We never talked before that. And he opened up to me. And then we went on the record, and we had this extraordinary conversation about how, like, really what was going on in his life and why he was acting erratically and all the pressures that he was feeling and what that was doing as it translated into his businesses. And it was all because, in just an impulsive way, I sort of understood, like, oh, this man needs to be seen as a human right now. And I said, how are you doing? And it was that moment that shifted the whole conversation. And that's not to say anything about Elon or what we think about anything about his business or his politics, but it was just the most crystalline example from my own reporting that not losing sight of the individual matters so much.
This conversation with Elon Musk had to be shocking, in a word. You had to have been thrown off. But at the same time, I think you said you understood that he needed to feel another human's concern for him. So to me, what that triggers is, how is it that while he might have needed that, he's not offering that. It wouldn't appear so with some of his business practices, maybe then, and I don't, arguably now. Um, how is it that he, and let's use not focus on him per se, but he and other leaders are human.
Yeah.
They have these human needs, and yet somehow they are not acknowledging those and honoring them in other members of the workforce and their broader communities and arguably civilization.
Yeah. So I want to go back to another moment from 2019, which was when the Business Roundtable, this big collection of CEOs, came out with their big new declaration about the purpose of the statement of purpose on the corporation.
I
right?
remember, I've seen that.
What companies are sort of supposed to be in business for? And I wrote this on the front page in the New York Times. It was a big deal. All the biggest CEOs talking about what really, at the end of the day, business was there for. And it was indeed sort of a reframing of the Milton Friedman era. They were saying we're turning the page on that, and that it's no longer just about profits for shareholders. In fact, what they said, if you go back and read what they wrote, we want to be great employers to our employees. We care about our people, and we want to be there for them when they're in the office, when they're home, when they're in their communities, right? It was this statement that businesses matter soup to nuts in society. And yet, if you look at what's happened since then, I think it's hard to make the case that corporate America has lived up to those lofty goals. And the reason, I would argue, goes all the way back to 1980.
Okay.
And it's not just Jack, but it was this focus on profits, right? Remember that tension that I talked about?
Yep.
This sense where a relentless focus on profits above all else puts leaders, even the best of them,
Yeah.
in this really difficult situation where no matter how much they may espouse to care about their employees, they are operating in a system that disincentivizes real investment in their people over the long term. And that is just, to me, one of the fundamental problems with our economy right now. And it's one that's not going to get fixed overnight.
Yeah. I would love to continue this conversation. There's going to be a part 2 because I want to hear what the future looks like. And I think you have a lens into that. So stay with us for part 2. David Gellis, thank you so much.
Thank you.